Hey, good morning, everyone. It is awesome to be with you. I got back from Flagler Palm Coast High School earlier this morning. Beachside sent coffee, donuts, bagels, munchkins as a way to thank our teachers and the staff at Flagler Palm Coast High School for their incredible work in a very difficult environment. Make sure you recognize them today, not just teachers, of course, teachers, but first responders, law enforcement, retail workers, and more. They are all doing a great job in very difficult circumstances. Right now, I'm excited to continue the series we've been doing on flawed heroes. Remember, the idea here is that God uses broken people to accomplish great things. He uses regular people like you and me. He used a man like Jonah, I almost said Job, like Jonah, to save 120,000 people. Jonah was a sinner like you and me. Jonah disobeyed God. He questioned God's judgment. He felt sorry for himself. He drove his self-centeredness. He even wondered about the point of going on. God uses broken people. Now, here's a quick caveat. Recognizing that God uses broken people doesn't change the need to pursue transformation. I don't want you to idealize Jonah's behavior or assume that you too should disobey God. You shouldn't, obviously. When I recognize an area of brokenness within me, and here's the deal, the older I get, the more God shows me. It feels like the older I get, the more I see how broken I am. But when I see that, I want to see God change that. I don't want to say, well, God uses broken people, so I'm just going to rejoice in my failings and stay where I'm at. I will celebrate that God uses me in spite of my failings, while praying for Him to shine light and bring transformation to those areas of my life. It's a balance between knowing God uses you and pursuing change in your life. So today we'll look at one of the central people of Scripture, King David. Before we do that, remember there are two main reasons we're looking at these people. First, here, 21st century America, our cancel culture tolerates no flaws. And yet, and this is the second part, if God uses flawed people, He'll use you and me. Put those two together for a second. We're tempted to think that because we have issues and because we have pasts and because we have presents and because we're likely going to have issues in the future, that we need to step back from serving. God isn't going to use people like us. That's the message our culture is sending right now. And yet God uses broken, flawed, regular people like you and me. We see God's grace in His willingness and His habit of using regular people to do great things. God uses broken people to touch lives, to bring healing and hope, and to share His love with the world. So let's talk about King David. Here's the really short version of his life. David was called to be king of Israel after the King Saul, failed God. Now, Saul was still king, and David loved and respected Saul as the anointed one of God. David grew close to Saul and his family. Saul's son Jonathan, for example, was a best friend of David's. David's fame grew. For example, most of you know the story of David and Goliath. It's that same David. And Saul grew jealous of David's fame and David's popularity. He persecuted David without reason, even though David was loyal, and chased him around Israel in attempts to kill him. Now, eventually, of course, David did become king and took Saul's place, and eventually all of Israel came under his rule. David loved God and lived a life of service to Him. God was with him, as the prophet Nathan says in, for example, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 3. Yet David had his dark side as well. And I want to read from 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 2 to 5, so let me bring that up. Split screen here. Okay, so you see 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 2 to 5. And it says this. One evening, David got up from his bed and was walking around the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, well, she was Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanliness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, I am pregnant. So again, that's 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 2 to 5. Now it gets worse. To cover up his adultery, he invited her husband Uriah back. Uriah was a soldier in David's army. He was deployed to duty. He was on the front. Uriah, being a good man, wouldn't go home with Bathsheba. He refused to go home and stay with his wife while he still had men in the field. David eventually had Uriah killed by putting him on the front line and then having the troops pull back. So in a short amount of time, David became an adulterer and a murderer. While he repented of that, it didn't necessarily get better. His family was deeply dysfunctional, including incest, murder, and a temporary coup by one of his sons. It's a great character, right? Yet he is lifted up throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament as an ideal king. Why? Well, it wasn't obviously because he was perfect or extra holy. It was because he pursued God in the midst of his pain and suffering. I'm going to bring up another split screen here, so let's go like this. There we go. David was a man after God's own heart. He pursued God in the midst of his pain and suffering. He's called a man after God's own heart in a number of places in Scripture. I've got a few verses there. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14 in the New Testament. Acts chapter 13, verse 22. Much of the book of Psalms is written by David. As an aside, the book of Psalms is a great book to read devotionally, whether you're new to the Bible or not. There's 150 Psalms. Some people say, you read 5 a day and get through it in a month. I personally think it's almost better to take a psalm or two at a time, and it's going to take you long to get through it, but read them devotionally, really meditate on them, and recognize that there are human struggles throughout Psalms. Some of them are beautiful, some of them are hard to read. They're talking about feeling separate from God and lost and afraid. David and the other authors of Psalms, but primarily David, wrestled with the same things that you and I wrestle with, and he struggled with his own brokenness and his own feeling at times of God just not being there. God used David. David sought God in all his imperfections and in all sufferings, and the message for us is to pursue that kind of faith. And you can learn from his faith. You can learn from that kind of faith by looking at the life of a man as broken as David. God used him. And God's all-knowing. He knew the failures David would experience. I don't believe for a second God picked David not knowing or believing any of the failings that David would go through. Those failures are not examples. Again, I'm not saying that you should run out and be like David by committing adultery and murder and that sort of thing. But you should have a heart like David. He was a man after God's own heart. He pursued God not just in spite of his brokenness, but because of his brokenness. When you fall short, this is when you need to seek God the most. That's the takeaway. Pursue God. Pursue God even more intensely when you stumble or fall. Grace is seen when when we pursue God and God uses us in spite of our humanity. Pray about that today. As I encouraged you yesterday, be honest about your failings and ask God to change you. But don't run. Don't think God has given up. And if God hasn't given up, and he hasn't, you don't get to give up either. I appreciate you watching today. I hope your week has started well. If you enjoyed the video, you know the drill. Like it, share it, invite others to watch, to grow. I had something cool this morning. We were at the high school, as I mentioned. We brought a bunch of treats for the teachers and staff. And one of the staff members there came up and said, I watch you guys. She talked about the church she goes to in a different town, but she said, I watch you guys. I watch your morning devotions. The point is, we don't create these videos because we're hoping that every single person who watches them will come to Beachside. We just want to bless you. And so share them, like them, invite others to share and like them, and to take time to grow together. It's a tough time right now, and we need each other, and we need to find opportunities to grow and to serve in the midst of a crazy world that will get better, but it's crazy right now. In the meantime, have a great Tuesday, and may God bless you. Take care.